Why did I start Steelo? This question is asked quite often, so it is high time I answer it. And welcome to today's Steelo Podcast, where I share the information from within Steelo. So, it all started back in 2007 when I started working for an engineering company. Although to explain why I started Steelo, I'll probably have to go even further back in time, because when I was a kid, I always wanted to join the army. And that was my mission when I was at high school and then university. And suddenly when I applied to join the army as an officer, my application was rejected. So I literally didn't have an idea for what I'm going to do next, so I decided I'm going to move to the UK. Bearing in mind I was brought up in South Africa, it just felt like a country with sort of the same mentality and the same way of living. So it was a natural next step for me, and the idea was to get as many certificates as I possibly could. Because the reason why my application was rejected was because of my dual nationality at birth, which obviously there was nothing I could do about. So when I arrived in the UK after graduating as an aeronautical engineer, I joined an engineering company in London that used to do everything. And they used to do everything not because they planned to do everything, it was just because the owners just were afraid to say no. So any inquiry that came our way, we looked into it, we quoted it, and then when we won it, we basically fulfilled the order. So for me, it was great. As a young engineer, I could learn about sort of various sectors. So we used to do things in glass, timber, plastic, designing machinery for the London Underground. And then every now and then there was a project with structural steel. And the thing that struck me was that at university you learn about new technology, about CNC machinery, about robots, about project management tools, about the software for project management. And suddenly I was in London, so one of the powerhouses of the globe, and what I saw was something I just couldn't believe. Fabrication was done manually. So good old tape measure, scriber, puncher, manual puncher, and then a magnetic drill, which is basically a drill with a magnetic base which attaches to a steel beam, and then you manually drill the hole. And I just couldn't believe it, that with all the technology available, actually steel is made sort of almost like in medieval times. So it almost became like a mission for me to revolutionize it. But still, back then, I still had the army on my mind. So I basically adopted like dual vision. On one hand, I was still preparing myself for the army, but on the other hand, I had a plan B for when the army rejects my second application again. So during that time, it was around 9 months, I was preparing myself for plan B, which was to start the business. So I learned what it takes to run a business. I went on to a 5-week sort of how to start a business course. Then I did a lot of bookkeeping with my grandfather. He was actually an academic teacher. So he taught me how to do the books the old way. So massive sheets of A3 paper with all the columns in the world, and you had to manually input all the data. Obviously it was all double entry. And actually that's one of the pieces of advice I always mention to anyone who is thinking of going into business, is to learn the numbers. Not how to use accounting software, but actually how the numbers work, all the technicalities behind the user interface. So it was 9 months. I was also doing the research in terms of what my offering will be, preparing the website, finding a place, and so on. And the one thing I had in mind was to bring the steel industry into the 21st century. And obviously, being young, I was very ambitious, naive as well. I thought it will be a much quicker journey. I thought that as soon as I start the business, people will be piling in through doors and windows. Unfortunately, that was never the case. So when I started on the 1st of September 2009, the first order was received at the end of October. and it was for a whopping amount of £57.50, and it was for steel plate, which I actually delivered on my bicycle. But I guess that's a story for another time. But the driving force was to revolutionize the steel industry. The beginnings were tough. I would say they were actually very, very tough. But because I was preparing myself for proper military selection, and it was taken away from me, I had all the energy in the world inside of me, and I just needed a way to let go. So whatever obstacles I had, I just overcame them, and there was literally nothing that could have been thrown at me that would take me out. To a point where I was sleeping next to steel beams outside because they were stolen ones, sleeping in a van when delivering the steel. But the most annoying thing back then was that the mission was to revolutionize the steel industry, whereas I was actually performing even worse than the company that I worked for. Fabrication was done sometimes literally outside in the weather. The deliveries were done on a very old van bought from travelers, and it was basically all embarrassing. And I had this inner conflict where I set out to revolutionize the industry, whereas I made probably 5 steps back, working out from a very old and small garage. But again, the driving force was the mission, the higher purpose, and that was always the driving force. It's like the north in a compass. I always knew where I wanted to be. And slowly and gradually, going through all the obstacles, we made our way into that position. We then moved into a much larger premises near Heathrow in London, and that's when we started investing in CNC machinery, but also, very importantly, into our own ERP system. An ERP system is basically a system that manages all the operations within the company. Decided to write our own because the ones that were available off the shelf actually just weren't made for the steel industry, because we operate in lengths rather than only numbers of items. So that was a task in itself. It was very ambitious, was very expensive, but I just knew that this will be the foundation of the new company, or the way I envisaged our company to operate. And indeed, it was a success. Then introduced a lot of methodologies like the theory of constraint by Eliyahu Goldratt, obviously lean manufacturing concepts, and a few other management concepts. And we basically created a very, very efficient manufacturing plant. The place, or the one thing I always questioned, is the way steel fabrication places looked, because by default people assume that because steel is dirty, then the places where you bash out steel, they have the green light or license to be dirty as well. I challenged that from the very beginning, so we made sure that our layout is carefully designed. We have lines that define various areas. The areas are then painted in different color, and also introducing 5S ideas. So basically, being blunt, just to clean up after yourself, so that you start the day with a nice cleaned workspace. And everything sort of revolved around efficiency and also bringing the steel industry into the 21st century. That was achieved probably 5 years after starting the business, maybe 6. I was naive because I thought I'll be able to achieve that within a year or two, but obviously that didn't happen. And actually, if I go back in time, the first name of the company was Struck Steel, which was short for structural steel, but then the tagline was Steelwork Management. So basically my idea was not to have a fabrication plant, which you can hear now probably in the background, we do have. And the idea was to only manage projects. So basically get the project somewhere in or around London, and then manage the fulfillment process. So manage the design or the detailing of the structure, outsource the fabrication, and then manage logistics and installation. Now, bearing in mind that this was in 2009, the middle of the previous recession, it was probably the worst time to start. And that is when I learned that actually there's something like a credit rating of a company. So even when I did have interested companies, when they saw my credit rating, which was basically 0, if not negative, because it was a fresh company, only a few weeks old, they refused to pay any deposits. And obviously I didn't have enough money to finance the project myself and then hope for the payments sometime in the future. Therefore, by default, I couldn't take those projects on board. So very quickly I had to readjust and almost flip my whole business plan upside down. So despite the meticulous 9 months of preparation, I had to quickly adjust my operations and take on a very small garage. Like I described, was a bit embarrassing because it was exactly the opposite direction as to the initially intended direction. But then from there I understood that actually having the fabrication facility is much better because you have the whole process under your control, and that is where we could start to revolutionize things. We were able to reduce the lead times from the normal, let's say 3 weeks down to 3 days. So that was a massive shift. And when we achieved what I set out to achieve, the drive for innovation never stopped. So very quickly, once we settled into our, let's say, highly efficient fabrication facility, I started exploring what's next. And there were other companies working already on robotic assembly of steel beams, meaning you have one robot with an electromagnet at the end that lifts a piece, puts it into the right position of the beam, and then another robot performs the welding. So I thought, well, if other companies are already working on it and they have much better resources to do it, then there's nothing we will achieve in that field. So I thought to myself, well, what is the next step after robotic assembly? And very quickly I concluded that it must be 3D printing of structural steel. So I sort of reached out to various people and sort of asked the question, how can we get involved in it? And based on that, we started working with Cranfield University, with a few other partners like Foster & Partners, BOC, the gas supplies, Weir Engineering, and also Windwire. And then also as a separate project, we're working with Imperial College London on creating optimized connections that are all 3D printed in steel. My vision for the future is that one day steel will not be fabricated in facilities like ours. They will basically become obsolete because steel will be delivered straight to site, and then robots will 3D print the connections in situ. So that's something we're working on. This will be a lengthy journey, but again, like from the very beginning or even before we started the business, the driving force was innovation, and it remains like this till today, and hopefully will continue until I die. So that's the mission, and that is why we started Steelo. One of the things I've learned, and it actually is some wisdom I heard from our accountant, is that you can either be on the leading edge or on the bleeding edge, which means that if you enter R&D on a too early stage, then you'll spend a lot and you won't be able to commercialize it. Whereas when you're on the leading edge, it means that someone else has been on the bleeding edge. They have wasted all the money, they validated the concept, and then you can take that on board and almost immediately commercialize it. And indeed, in some cases, I can 100% agree that we are on the bleeding edge. So with that wisdom, I actually did make some changes, and I do see various projects in a different way now when taking this into account. Nevertheless, watch this space. We are innovating the steel industry. We are coming up with various robotic solutions, so there's more to come. And yeah, please remember to subscribe to our podcast if you'd like to follow us and never miss an episode. Thank you.